In a lab in the 1960s, there is a rat alone in a cage. Two water bottles hang above it. One is plain water. The other is laced with morphine. Within days, that rat is drinking almost nothing else. It ignores food. It stops grooming. Some rats in these experiments pressed a lever to dose themselves so relentlessly they died of it, choosing the drug over water, over sleep, over their own survival. For decades, this was the entire scientific case for what addiction is. A chemical hijacks the brain, and once it gets its hooks in, the animal, and by extension the person, has no real say in the matter anymore. That single image, one rat, one cage, one drug, became the foundation for how an entire century treated addiction, as a moral failure to resist a chemical that overpowers free will. In the late 1970s, a Canadian psychologist named Bruce Alexander looked at that experiment and noticed something almost nobody else had thought to question. Every one of those rats was alone. Not alone for an afternoon, alone for the entire experiment, sealed inside a small metal box with nothing to do, nobody to interact with, and two bottles as the only decision it was ever allowed to make. Alexander's question was simple and, at the time, close to heretical. Was the rat addicted to the drug? Or was the rat addicted to the only source of relief available, inside a cage that offered nothing else? To find out, he built something that had never existed in an addiction lab before. He called it Rat Park. Instead of a bare metal box roughly the size of a shoebox, Rat Park was an open enclosure about 200 times larger, painted with murals, scattered with cedar shavings, wheels to run on, balls to play with, boxes to hide in, and enough space for a colony of rats to live together the way rats actually live in the wild. Males and females, socializing, mating, raising litters, forming the kind of group structure a solitary steel cage makes physically impossible. Then Alexander ran the same test. Rat Park's residents got the same two bottles every isolated rat had faced for decades, plain water and morphine-laced water, and were left completely free to choose. The isolated rats, just like every experiment before them, gravitated hard toward the morphine. The Rat Park rats mostly didn't. Even when Alexander sweetened the morphine water to make it more appealing, masking the bitterness, the colony rats still drank a fraction of what the isolated rats consumed, some avoiding it almost entirely. And it went further than that. Alexander took rats that had already been isolated and made dependent on morphine, the ones already showing every sign of compulsive use, and moved them into Rat Park. Given a real environment and real company, most of them cut their morphine intake dramatically on their own, choosing plain water over the drug they had supposedly already been captured by. The chemical hadn't changed. The cage had. The implication was enormous, and it landed almost nowhere. Alexander published the results in the late 1970s and early 1980s, and the two most prestigious journals in science, Science and Nature, both declined to publish it. The study that should have rewritten the foundational model of addiction sat instead in smaller, less visible journals, and largely stayed there for decades. Part of the resistance was scientific. Rat Park was messy by design, hard to standardize, difficult to replicate exactly, and later replication attempts produced mixed results depending on how closely they matched Alexander's specific conditions. But part of the resistance wasn't scientific at all. Rat Park arrived in the middle of an era openly declaring a war on drugs, one built entirely on the premise that the chemical itself was the enemy. A study suggesting the real driver was isolation and environment didn't fit the story the moment needed. While Rat Park was being ignored in the lab, an accidental human version of the same experiment was already unfolding in the real world, and it produced almost exactly the same result. During the Vietnam War, heroin use among American soldiers reached staggering levels. By some estimates, as much as 15 to 20% of enlisted soldiers were regularly using heroin in Vietnam, numbers that terrified officials back home, bracing for an epidemic of returning addicts. A A psychiatrist named Lee Robbins was commissioned to track what actually happened once those soldiers came home. The expected epidemic never arrived. Robbins found that the overwhelming majority of soldiers who had been heavily using heroin in Vietnam, somewhere around 90%, simply stopped, without treatment, without relapse, once they were pulled out of the stress, isolation, and chaos of the war, and returned to ordinary lives with families, routines, and purpose waiting for them. The drug hadn't changed. The environment had. And the addiction mostly went with it. Put the two side by side, and the old model starts to look thin. A rat alone in a steel box with nothing to do reaches for the only relief on offer. And so does a young man dropped into a war zone with nothing to do but survive it. Pull either one out of isolation and back into a life with connection, stimulation, and purpose, and the pull of the drug weakens on its own, without anyone forcing it. Alexander summed up his conclusion in a phrase that still unsettles people who assume addiction is purely a chemistry problem. The opposite of addiction isn't sobriety, it's connection. None of this means the chemistry is irrelevant. Morphine, heroin, and their relatives genuinely do rewire the brain's reward circuitry. And dismissing that would be its own kind of myth. But Rat Park, and the accidental human experiment that echoed it, made an uncomfortable case that the chemical was never the whole story, and might not even be the most important part of it. A drug can offer relief. Whether an animal or a person needs to keep reaching for that relief seems to depend heavily on what else their life actually contains. That idea eventually found its way out of obscure journals and into policy. Portugal decriminalized personal drug possession in 2001 and rebuilt its entire approach around treatment, housing, and reintegrating users back into community and work, rather than isolating them further through incarceration, and watched overdose deaths and addiction rates fall in the years that followed. It's not a perfect real-world replica of Rat Park, but it runs on the same underlying bet Alexander made in a converted lab in British Columbia decades earlier, that the cage might have been doing more of the damage than the drug ever did. So the next time you hear addiction described as a simple hijacking, a chemical that captures a brain and leaves the person no real choice, remember the two rats. One of them was alone in a box with nothing but a bottle. The other had a colony, space to run, and something to belong to. Neither of them chose the life that shaped their answer, but the answer changed anyway, the moment the cage did.